What's going on, everybody? Welcome to a very itchy episode here at the stable. Itchy because today we're going to be working on, and say it with me here, fiberglass. How would that even get you itchy? Soy alérgico. It's fiberglass. Fiberglass is what we're working with today. More specifically, fiberglass mat. We're not going to be using fiberglass cloth today, and I'll explain why and the differences in a bit. And we're going to be using that fiberglass mat and resin a couple different ways to address some of the present issues on this body. The first reason being to fill some holes. This, for example, was the hole for the antenna, which is going to be deleted. Therefore, we have to fill it. And back here, we have another couple issues that need to be addressed. One of those issues being more holes that we need to fill. I don't know what was going on here, but none of these were being used. It looks like they were trying to find the stud or something. And interestingly enough, I can tell that this area right here has already been patched before. If we take a look at the underside, we will see some previous patches, and my guess would be that they were trying to cover up some previous holes. So again, we are going to fill all of these properly because a license plate does not require 10 holes. And it's kind of hard to see on camera, but this area right here was previously patched. It looks like some fairly large holes, and we have some very bad waviness here. So we will address that issue as well. And the second thing we are going to do with the fiberglass and resin is crack repair, which luckily enough, this car does not have a lot of, but they still need to be addressed. Like this one right here. It's not a major crack, but we will need to do some work in order to make it right. And while we're in this area right here, we will also be deleting these bumper bracket cutouts. The owner decided to ditch the rear bumper completely, which I agree with. I really like the shape of this body, and I felt like the bumper kind of took away a little bit of that visual. And speaking of cracks, here's some major ones. In the door sill area, we have some pretty gnarly cracking going on here. And it's the same story on either side of the car. You can see I sanded it down a bit just to see how far the crack actually goes. We'll dive a little bit further into that later on, but right now let's just fill some holes. Starting off with the antenna, there's a couple things we have to do to prepare the area in order to accept new fiberglass and resin. Good enough. As you can see, we just exposed a little bit more area to work with, and this doesn't mean that our fiberglass sheets are going to be this big, not at all, but it's just more area to feather out and work around. If we take a really close look at this antenna hole, you can see that the edges are pretty hard. There's kind of a 90-degree drop down into this hole. I don't want to lay fiberglass on a hard edge like that, so instead we are going to concave this area. Concave? Angel, what are you talking about? Well, let's take a look at this example. Basically, this is just an exploded view of what we're dealing with right now. This is our fiberglass body. The top side will be what we can see from the outside of the car. The underside will obviously is under the car. Right here we have our antenna hole, and if you remember the sharp 90-degree turn that we have in the antenna hole, let's say this red area is our first, second, and maybe third layer of fiberglass. And maybe we get a little bit of resin dripping in the hole. When we are to sand it smooth, we basically get rid of all the fiberglass that we just laid and instead get stuck with these little schmutz of resin that happen to fall through. So what I want to do instead is concave the area just a bit, and that just means creating more of a bowl shape. We can fill and use the concave to our advantage, because now when we sand everything flat, we're not going to get rid of all of the fiberglass we laid and just rely on the little bit of resin that fell through. As you can see, we have a nice concave shape around all of the repair area. We dug it down just about half of the thickness of the fiberglass. I definitely don't want to concave this all the way to the inside, because at that point we will be making this previous fiberglass pretty razor thin, and that could introduce a whole other set of problems. But Angel, what's gonna stop all the fiberglass from falling through? Well, we're not done yet. So now that we've prepared the top surface for our fiberglass repair, Now we have to do the underside. So the bottom side of the repair is going to look a little bit different from the top side because on the bottom we can add as much fiberglass and material as we like because, well, it's on the bottom. It's not going to be seen. Whereas if we add a bunch of material to the top side, then we're gonna have a lump. But here's the kicker, because we're also going to concave the bottom side in order for us to push fiberglass material and bond it with the top repair as well. So now our repair turns into this almost anvil shape, which I feel would give us the best strength because any force downwards is supported by that top concave and any force upwards is supported by this bottom concave and patch. So all of it kind of sandwiches the old fiberglass. And by the way, this top part is not going to be directly flush with the body lines of the car, but we'll get to that in a bit. Taking a look at the back side, we are going to grind away probably about a 6 to 8 inch diameter area to ensure we have good bondage between the new fiberglass and the old fiberglass. And just like that, we have exposed a good amount of that cloth and resin. It had some pretty thick, I think it's like undercoating material. It was very rubbery and dark, but in order to ensure it bonds correctly, we have to expose that resin and fiberglass. So again, we strictly just want the fiberglass to be on fiberglass. And look at what happens when I turn on the light under here. It's kind of crazy. Boo! So if you guys remember, I concaved the top area so it kind of forms a little bit of a bowl shape, but I also added a little bit of a concave to the bottom area. That way the old fiberglass would be sandwiched. And I feel that would give us a better and stronger patch. And now we could get into the yucky stuff, the fiberglass and resin itself, which you kind of have to have a plan in mind when doing this because you only have about an 8 to 15 minute window before it starts to harden up. So there is a couple things we can do to make this process a bit more seamless. And one of those things is to pre-cut our material. So for the patch that's going to go on the underside of the car, I'm going to make 2 circles. One at 2 inches and another one at 3.5 inches. So the way I decided what size to make the bottom patch was because the hole was exactly 1 inch. The first patch I'm going to make a little bit wider than that, sitting at about 2 inches. The next patch that is going to get stacked on top of there, I'm going to make it a bit wider at 3.5 inches. So I have these 3 circles here that we've cut out. I was going to use all 3, but I think we should be more than fine with just using 2, one of the 2-inch ones and a 3.5-inch one. For the top side, however, we are absolutely not going to add a patch this large. Instead, we want something that will sit just inside of that concaved area. And what I mean by just inside of that concave is if the center of our hole is exactly 1 inch, then the outsides of our concave is going to be roughly 1.5 inches. And I guess you could make it bigger than this, but anything outside of this concaved area will be sanded away anyway. And I've cut this little piece out of cardboard just to give us a good template. And using our template, we are going to try our best to cut out a circle this size, even though our scissors are not that sharp. Ah, I cut my glove. All right, let's see what our little patches look like. I think that's just about the right size right there. And if you happen to be doing this, always remember to protect yourself with eye protection gloves and a respirator. I wasn't wearing a respirator when I was cutting the glass because I was talking to you. So if I die, it's your guys' fault. So again, we already have our sections pre-cut in order to make this more seamless. These 2 are for the bottom and these 3 are for the top. I don't think we will use all 3. We might just only use 2, but for those of you with your thinking caps on, you might be saying, well, how are we going to prevent that bottom layer from sagging or just straight up falling off of the panel? Well, I've come up with this contraption, which consists of a dishwashing sponge wrapped in wax paper and supported by an old spreader. Well, what the hell are you gonna do with that? Well, let me tell you, the softness of the sponge is going to contour with the body very well. The spreader on the bottom side is going to ensure an even pressure on the sponge itself. And the wax paper wrapped around both of them will prevent that fiberglass resin from sticking onto this. So it makes for a perfect support on the underside. And I've already tested it out, so before you laugh, just look. We are going to use a combination of things to make this work. This hydraulic jack is holding up this paint stick, which is just putting a light, very light pressure on our sponge contraption here. And the reason why we want that very light pressure pushing up on those bottom patches is once we start adding the top fiberglass and start dabbing it with the brush, without that support, we will end up just pushing everything through the hole and ruining our whole job. That's enough yapping though. We have everything set up. We've already cleaned our surfaces on the top and the bottom. So let's get to glassing. The instructions state that for every 1 ounce of resin, we need 10 drops of hardener. So I'm gonna mix up 2 ounces of resin, 2 ounces of resin. So that means we have to add 20 drops of the hardener. And you wanna make sure to be as precise as you can with these instructions, because if you add too much hardener, your resin will become too brittle and it will crack and break. And if you don't add enough hardener, then you're just gonna wait for it to harden up, and it never will. For the application itself, I'm just gonna use a simple chip brush, but I am going to cut the bristles a little bit to give us a little bit more control when we're dabbing in that resin. Alrighty folks, it's time. Let's add our hardener. Once again, 20 drops, and that's when the time starts. So let's see if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. We're gonna mix it really well, scraping off all the edges. Now that we have that mixed, we're gonna go ahead and add some resin all the way around, getting into all those voids. Once it's completely transparent, I'm gonna go ahead and add the smaller one. Before we add this patch though, we have to prime our areas with some of this resin. And now we can add our patch, and using the same brush, we're going to dab some more resin, which in turn will push out all of the air bubbles. Now we could add our sponge contraption. And while we still have some resin available, we're going to dab up our little ones. And then we can lightly place, we're on a time limit here. Dab, 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 dab. I don't exactly want this to be flush. I want enough room in the concave to add some filler. Alrighty, and in the race against time, I think we came out ahead. You can see our patch right here is just starting to harden up, and I did end up adding all 3 of the tiny patches up top, but towards the last one it started getting real sticky, real gummy, so I knew that was probably the last minute I had. The little sponge contraption did its job more than well. It held up that bottom patch really nice, and it pushed that bottom patch up into the concave that we made on that bottom side. And with the dabbing of the brush on the top side, it pushed that into the concave. So again, we just sandwiched the original fiberglass. And look at that, a couple minutes later, and this thing is completely set. I'm just kidding, it hasn't been a couple minutes, it's actually been sitting overnight. And look at that, that's it's just the cool desk prop now. But anyway, let's take a look at our repair that has now been sitting overnight and is fully cured. As you can see, it's hardened up very well. And again, the patches that we put over top of it are hugging the concaved area that we made around the antenna hole. That alone would have been enough to support this repair, so we technically didn't have to do a bottom patch, but I mean, it only made the repair that much stronger. And obviously we can still see the circle. The intent behind this was not to completely make it flush, but rather leave a small indentation for us to fill with that kitty hair. This shallow area that it has is probably around 1/16 in depth. We could add a little bit more fiberglass on top of it to make it as flush as we can. Let me show you guys why I wouldn't keep stacking on the surface of the fiberglass to make it flush. Because right here we have a really good example on that exact method being done. It's a bit difficult to see here, but that previous patch that was repaired right there has created a big lump that does not follow the contours of this body. You can see how the light kind of wraps around that area right there. And that's because this car used to have the fuel filler neck in this area right here, which has left us a bulge of of probably 3 to 4 inches here. Again, it's really hard to see now that it's sanded, but when it did have the glossy paint on top, it was very noticeable. And if we were to just leave it like this and repaint it, you're gonna see that giant patch right here. Now this area right here is going to be a little bit tricky, a little bit difficult to get right, because we have to knock down all of the excess fiberglass that's creating that bulge without ruining the current body lines of the car, while at the same time replicating what we have on this side. But in the meantime, let's get back on the antenna hole. Alrighty, so this is what it looks like after we hit it with some 80 grit sandpaper. We definitely want to remove all of the shiny spots because our filler will not stick. Nothing will stick to the shiny spots. And now we can grab some of this kitty hair that y'all been hearing me yap about. But first, let me get all of these paintings out of the way. Interesting story with this. We transformed the shop into a paint and karaoke night. I did film a lot of it and decided that that will be a Patreon only video. So if you'd like to see some of this, go check it out. And this is just going to be mixed and used in the same way you would any other body filler. It looks like splooge from the movie Holes. I like to do figure eights and then squish it down. Do some more figure eights, squish it down, get it all off of your spreader. It's looking uniform now. And I like to add tape on any body line adjacent to a repair. It just makes it cleaner in avoiding you damaging the body line. We're gonna start off with a very thin layer, and we're kind of just forcing all of this into the voids. And our second pass, we are then going to fill. This is kind of just what's going to go on top of it to fill in any voids, and the tape comes off. So being that this filler has all of those fibers in there, all of that fiberglass, we are 100% not going to reach that glassy finish with only this. Hence why back in the year, who knows when they repaired this section, it's kind of the same thing we're doing here. They added this kitty hair right on top of the raw fiberglass and then added filler on top of the kitty hair. Now, while we wait for that to dry, let's go ahead and take care of some of these smaller holes. Oh, but before I do that, let me show you guys why I chose the fiberglass mat rather than the fiberglass cloth. The fiberglass mat is really good for repairs and shaping, whereas the fiberglass cloth is really good for structure and strength. You can see down in the engine bay, most of the structure of this car is made with fiberglass cloth. You can see the cloth pattern on the insides. But sometimes when it's used up on the surface, it will show through. Take these areas back here, for example. You can see the cloth pattern coming through from underneath the paint. Even in this corner right here where it's been kind of sanded through, you can still see some of that cloth pattern popping up through here. And by no means am I a fiberglass expert. This is just kind of how I understand it and how I've used it. Okay, back to these little holes. As you can see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 holes to fill. So on the underside of the backside, you can see there was 2 previous patches done in the past. And it's interesting to see that they only used one piece of cloth, and then they didn't really fill the front with anything. They kind of just used that backing as the new material to put a screw in. Wow, guys, I'm here editing this video right now and I cannot for the life of me figure out what that sound was. Use that backing. I swear it was not a fart. And I know it makes me sound more guilty by saying it wasn't a fart, but I don't even know. Anyway, back to our scheduled program. You can see kind of what I mean here. This top hole has that fiberglass mat laying behind it, and it's unused because they didn't put anything through it. And then right here, again, you can see some of that fiberglass cloth texture coming through here. This was another repair. It looks like they did it from the front and the back, but there's still some pretty big dips right here. So we're gonna have to grind this down and address it. And I'm kind of tired of saying the word fiberglass, cloth, mat, and resin. So let's just get busy. It wasn't a fart. But anyway, we're gonna start preparing this area by concaving these holes as well as exposing most of the fiberglass material so we can have proper bondage. While I'm here in this area, I'm also going to expose the fiberglass on the areas where we will be doing that bumper bracket delete. And when I got to the other side, we started revealing something weird. It looks like a previous repair, which was right under where we knew they had filled in that fuel filler neck hole. But for the most part, I'm just exposing most of the fiberglass and preparing it with an 80 grit scratch. All right, so I'm very much enjoying this process because the more we dig into this car, the more it tells us about its past life. I mean, I'm very much not enjoying how itchy the fiberglass is making me, but let's see what we've learned. First off, on this rear corner where we had already seen there was a crack, after removing all of the paint, we can see a previous repair here, kind of just undoing itself right here. And I believe this repair is failing due to the fact that the repair itself, the new resin and fiberglass that they laid, is over paint. They didn't take it all the way down to the old fiberglass and resin, and this area seems to have a whole lot of flex. So with the combination of that flex and the repair not being bonded to the previous fiberglass, I think that's why we have this lifting right here. So we have to completely grind that down so we can get a proper patch in there. And I'm definitely not knocking on the people who made that repair, because those are kind of things that you don't know they're gonna fail until they fail a couple of years later, or in this case, a couple of decades later. And if we move our attention a little bit north, we will see this area, which again, was where the previous hole for the fuel filler neck was, and you can see the discoloration, or I'm sorry, the difference in colors here, and this is where they made that patch. And that repair kind of confuses me because it's impressive and disappointing at the same time. Impressive because the blend between the new fiberglass and the old fiberglass is damn near seamless, but then there's a giant lump right here, so that's why I'm so torn with this repair, because if they had the skill to blend this repair in that well, I'm not sure why they would have left this bump. So let's move on to another failed repair, which is this area that we saw was wavy. And this one I find pretty interesting because if we look at the backside, we get to learn what works, how they did it, and what we should do now to prevent a repair from failing. So once we uncovered it, we can see that the edges are all failing, and if we push on it a little bit, we could even see some light through on the other side. And with the flashlight on the backside, it kind of looks like an x-ray, and you can see both of the previous repairs. I sent the pictures to the owner and we were both trying to figure out what those repairs were, if it was rear-ended or if they were covering up previous accessories or something like that. Some things we can get an answer for, like we know this was a previous fuel filler neck hole. Some things we won't get an answer to, like why there was 7 unused holes. So while we were wondering what these holes were previously used for and why they were patched, I noticed that this repair on the left is a circle and has 4 holes on each corner. I thought to myself, that looks kind of familiar. I don't know, you guys tell me, but I think it looks like this guy right here. So let's figure it out here. About yay much, and look at that. All 4 of these corners align exactly the same as this guy. Well, cool, it looks like it was likely for a trailer connection, But what about the other one? Being that the other repair is aligned pretty much dead nuts on the center line of the car, there's a mounting point here, here, and in the center. It's likely that this car might have been equipped with a light duty tow hitch. I'm not entirely convinced though, being that this is a pretty small pass-through for a hitch. But then again, it wouldn't be the weirdest thing this car is equipped with, because if you guys remember, it has a built-in sleeping compartment. Let me know what you think it is, because man, you guys have provided me with a ton of information and insight in regards to this series and project car. And that's why I love sharing these videos, because we're pretty much learning about it together. But anyway, it's time to start glassing, and I'm actually gonna suit up this time because I don't want to be itchy anymore. I don't want to be itchy anymore. Literally, all the way. Oh man, the zipper almost cut my throat. I'm gonna start off with these smaller holes first. Anyway, I've concaved them just a little bit, just like we did with the antenna hole, as well as sanded the actual inside edges. And that's actually a really important point. We of course want to put a sanding scratch on all of the top side as well as the bottom side, but we also want to put a sanding scratch all along the insides of the hole or crack. And the reason for that is once we put our repair and all of that resin starts to fall in there, then all this resin actually sticks and bonds to the insides. Whereas if we don't put a sanding scratch, yes, the resin will still fall in there, it will still cure the same, but it won't actually be stuck and bonded to the insides right here. On top of that, depending on how long the hole has been there, there's possibly years of crud building up on these edges, further preventing a proper bond between the new and the old fiberglass. We could technically just use kitty hair to fill in those holes and it would probably be fine, but I definitely don't want to risk probably. So we're gonna add a little bit of resin and fiberglass and then top coat it with some kitty hair. I was trying to put in some pieces of fiberglass on the front side like we did with the antenna hole, but it just wasn't agreeing with me. But we got something interesting going on right here. As you can see, we're missing that previous patch that was here, and here it is. I literally just put some light pressure on it and bloop, it popped out like a Lego. So this is what we don't want to happen. So we're gonna go ahead and prep this area to accept another patch. I don't think we need to redo the circle one. So after this discovery, I basically just prepared the area in the same fashion that we did the antenna hole, making sure all of the inside edges were scratched. But while I was doing this, something very interesting happened. Well, I'm glad my curiosity got the best of me on this one, because not only did the rectangle pop out like a Lego, but the circle did too. I already cleaned up, concaved, and sanded this area. I think the issue with these might lie in the edges. As you can see, they're pretty flat and a hard angle right there. So that's why I'm concaving it and sanding it on the inside so the resin actually sticks on the inside rather than just being supported by the front and the back side. But yeah, now we have to make some patches that look like these guys. Alrighty, I was about to start laying the new patches and the fiberglass, but then I had a thought, and that is, if this entire circle popped out with ease, then what's to say that these smaller holes that were just covered up with what looks like resin won't pop out the same way? So let's see. Look at that. That's not even much pressure here, guys. Holy moly, I'm glad we did this. So we're gonna go ahead and give these the same concave, clean them up on the inside, sand them on the inside, and give them the same treatment. And out of curiosity, look at that. Look at that, 100% it was for one of these things. Cool beans. So we have our surfaces nice and prepped. The front, back, and insides of the holes have all been sanded, cleaned, and we have all of our cutouts ready. So we're pretty good to go. And one thing though, since I am laying these fairly large pieces on the back side, I will be using a fiberglass roller, which is just a roller with a bunch of these little slits inside of them. That way, once we get it on the panel, we can roll out all of the air bubbles as well as the excess resin. Well, we did it. This now has its first round of patches. Hopefully we don't need another round. I'm gonna see what it looks like after it hardens up. But it went fairly well considering how big that patch was on the back, as well as the three different shapes that we had to fill in on the front side. I tried to get all the bubbles out, and I used a piece of wax paper on the back side to hold the back while I was putting the front patches in, and it looks like it came out pretty good. So once that dries, we can decide if we want to lay some more fiberglass on it or just continue with kitty hair like we did on the antenna hole. Speaking of antenna hole, this is fairly dry now, so let's go ahead and sand this. And because it's a fairly small repair, we're just going to use a regular small block. Alrighty, so after sanding, this is what we're left with. You can see how the kitty hair kind of just conformed itself into that concave that we made for the patch, but we're not done yet. Alrighty, and now we can use some actual filler. Same thing as before. Just gonna give it a couple figure eights. Squish. I was always told not to mix with a paint stick because it can introduce bubbles, or I'm sorry, air pockets into the filler itself. But I have seen people do it that way before. Honestly, it's just whatever you feel comfortable with. And just like last time, I'm gonna start with a very thin coat and push it down, and then we can start shaping. Let's not forget to remove the tape, because if we do, it's a freaking pain once it dries. All right, we can start sanding now, and if we're lucky, this is gonna be our only pass. I always preach the use of guide coat, but when you just lay your filler down, it's gonna act as its own guide coat. As you can see, the dark spots are what hasn't been touched yet. And it looks like that first round of filler is all we're gonna have to do. Yes, sirree. That antenna hole is completely deleted now, and we can still feather this out a little bit more. It's currently at 80 grit. We can bump it up to like 150 or 180, but I need to wait to see what primer we're going to use in order to know what grit to finalize this in. And I know I had previously stated that I wasn't going to do any filler work on the fiberglass itself, but I feel like in this case, with the repairs and the patches, that's the best way to go about it, just so there's not a primer in between the kitty hair and the body filler. But I'm still not going to do any filler work in terms of correcting the waviness of the panels until we get a coat of epoxy on there. Because when I lay the filler to make these panels flat, I want the filler to be on a single substrate rather than, say, if I lay filler on this panel, the filler is going to be touching like 4 different coats. And for my peace of mind, I'd rather the filler just be on a single epoxy coat rather than having it be on a splotchy surface. So filler work on the fiberglass is going to be strictly limited to the repair areas. And again, we want to make sure to immediately clean our spreader. Hey, aren't you allergic to those? ¿Qué te importa? My bad. Anyway, our patches are now completely dry. We can go ahead and remove this wax paper from the back side. I think I am going to dig this one out a little bit because we got a very big air bubble trapped in this one, but it shouldn't be too hard now that the back side has hardened up a bit. So we gotta start sanding that area, but I can't find my coveralls. And here we go, sanding once again to get everything smooth, as well as digging out all of the areas that had possible air pockets. And we did end up adding 3 more layers of that fiberglass mat to that rectangle piece. But what took the longest was sanding all of the holes once again. They do have to be resanded once we had that new resin come in. Alrighty, so the new patch that we added to that rectangle area has now dried. So let's see what we got. And here we have the result. As you can see, our resin has now hardened up, so we have to resand this area. And it's crazy to think that it's still a little bit shallow, even though it has like around 6 to 7 layers of fiberglass on there. And you might be thinking, well, one repair is thicker than the other repair, but let me show you something. This car is not exactly even on the thickness of the fiberglass all the way around. Let's look at how consistent the fiberglass thickness really is. In this area, we are about 5/16 in thickness. And if we move directly to the other side, we are at about 3/32 of an inch in thickness. So the fiberglass all around is pretty much inconsistent, but they laid it thick enough where it's not really an issue if it's inconsistent. Because back in the day, they didn't know how thick fiberglass, or sorry, how thin fiberglass could actually be. So they just stacked it and stacked it and stacked it, which is kind of good in our case because that just means we have a little bit more material to work with. Alrighty, so we've sanded that new patch. This whole area is pretty much prepped and ready to go for some kitty hair, but I wanted to show you guys something first. I wanted to show you guys how strong this stuff actually is. As you can see, before, when we did this, it just popped it out like a Lego piece, and now, I mean, I could push the entire car with this area. And if we take a look at the holes, if you guys remember, we sanded the inside of them before we laid that back piece of resin and fiberglass, so the inside of the hole has now been reinforced with just a tiny bit of that resin. So with that back patch and that resin kind of attaching itself to the insides of the holes, we're going to try the same test we did before, and look at that. I mean, I'm putting enough pressure to push the car into these holes, and look at that. So I'm confident these repairs are strong enough for us to apply that kitty filler, which will also enhance that strength. Alrighty, so we got our first coat of kitty hair on there. But while that dries, I actually wanted to show you guys something cool. These are the 3 main components we've been working with this entire time. If we take a close look, you can see all of the fibers and all of the strands that are within this hardened mixture. And again, these strands actually give it quite a bit of strength compared to standard body filler. And then lastly, we have the resin that we have been mixing. This also hardens up really good. But now that this stuff is dry, we're gonna go ahead and give it the same treatment we did to the antenna hole, give it a good buzz, sand off all of the excess, and prepare for our next step. The next step, of course, being lightweight body filler, which was the most tiring because, I mean, you have to use your whole body for this step. But with the long block, we reveal and highlight all of the low spots, which then have to be sanded once again with an 80 grit scratch before we apply another coat of that lightweight body filler. Alrighty, a lot of sanding dust later, and we are now done. This came out really nice. Obviously, you can tell where the repair is because, well, it doesn't have any primer or paint on it. But we do have something cool on the way in regards to primer and paint. But yeah, I'm very happy with the results. I have no doubt that it will hold up fine, especially because of that kitty hair that we added in between the fiberglass resin and the body filler. Also, guys, I'm not sure, but I think Ozzy's dead. There's only one way to find out. ¿Qué pasó? I knew it. Ooh. So again, we completely deleted the antenna hole as well as the 9 random unused holes that were around here. Again, once we put some primer on here, we can see how well we actually made this repair. By the way, I very much appreciate how much of you have found an interest in this build. I almost feel guilty to say that I want to keep working on this car, but we really need to get the scraps thing running and driving. And again, that's what we're going to get into in the next episodes. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one.